Gabriele Hegerl, a member of Leopoldina, and professor of climate system science at the University of Edinburgh. Gabriele's research focuses on understanding the causes of climate change and using observations to constrain predictions of future climate change. She's determined causes of change in temperature, rainfall, and extreme events, and she's co-authored the US National Academy's report on extreme event attribution. She's had key roles in scientific assessments of climate change, for example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and she's been involved in the IPCC synthesis report, which brings together understanding of physical climate change, its impacts, and the economics of climate change and mitigation. As well as being a fellow of Leopoldina, she's also a fellow of the Royal Society and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So she's here in all sorts of capacities. Professor Gabriele, it's a pleasure to welcome you, and I'm going to ask you to talk to us now on the impacts of climate change on human rights.
Thank you so much. I have done the physical scientist thing and have brought slides. Is that all right? Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I think we feel like we can't talk if we don't. Okay, so everything comes with a caution that I'm a physical scientist. So when I speak about something like human rights, I'm like extremely far out of my comfort zone. But I was trying to think a little bit about how climate change, as that we experience now and that we project forward, might be impacting on human rights, coming very much from the climate events point of view. And I think we have recently seen several events where the right of life was threatened. So we have seen the very extremely damaging European floods this summer, where a lot of people died, actually, even in highly developed countries. I think this event not only was an extremely rare event, so the World Weather Attribution, which is a consortium of a few researchers that analyze very rapidly extreme events as they have happened, have come to the conclusion that it was about a once in 500-year event on the River R. It's quite tricky to estimate something like this, particularly in a highly developed country where the rivers change how they are managed quite frequently. So I would take that number with a grain of salt, but they also concluded that the same kind of event would have been less severe quite a while ago. So even in a highly adapted, in a highly developed country, this caused a lot of problems, very huge damage and fatalities. It emphasizes that as we move into a more and more changing climate, we need to adapt quite urgently. And I think one of the things I would like us to do is consider that adaptation is not giving up. It is just addressing what is coming and making the best of it, and doesn't prevent us from trying to counteract it. Then I think the previous speaker has already said that climate change is fundamentally extremely unfair. This is a very old paper, but it's the same message is still true today. So it just looks at temperature in different regions. So here Africa, for example, in a model, how temperature varies around from year to year and month to month, and compares it to a baseline of the normally experienced climate. And you can see that that the red, the evolving climate change, comes out much more quickly from the variability than it does, for example, in a country like the United States, where you have a lot more variability. Although it comes out reasonably quickly there due to a high change. So, but there is this really much reduced variability in the tropics, and that means that you have a much higher signal, what we call signal to noise ratio. So you get to see highly unusual climates much more quickly. And if you compare how quickly the signal comes out, how quickly the variability is much larger, the change is much larger than the variability, and plotted against the CO2 emissions per capita, you can see that the Annex 1 countries have very high CO2 emissions and tend to have somewhat lower temperature signals relative to variability. So you have this big block of dots of less developed countries that are going to be affected quite strongly, yet have contributed very little to the problem. I think that's really well understood and a fundamental issue, and is underlying a lot of the discussions, I think, associated with COP. This is a busy diagram, but all I want you to focus on is the colors. So this looks at heat waves in the present time in the front top row, and at 3 degrees in the bottom row, and levels of global warming in between. And if you look at severe, dangerous, or deadly heat waves and temperatures for humans, you wind up increasingly with dangerous levels as you go up to warmer global mean warming levels. And those again are very much in the developing countries. And those are kind of heat stress levels. So this is a heat stress metric for which it is dangerous for humans to be outside. I think there's a clear link to the right to life. And we should be concerned as we go into an increasingly warming world, that this really could have very severe impacts on the people living in the regions that are exposed to these heat waves. This is a super busy diagram from the recent IPCC, but I'm not going to use a lot of it. We see the September's Arctic sea ice decline. So not only the developing countries in the tropics are affected, but we also see the sea ice decline quite strongly. This is the past, and so this is going into the future, depending on how much gets emitted. We are looking into entirely ice-free Arctic in the September, or somewhat ice-reduced Arctic. And there has been a very interesting book written by an Inuit woman on the right to be cold, and the way their culture is affected by the severe warming of the Arctic that comes on top of very large variability, but still affects their livelihoods by, for example, making it much harder to hunt on the ice, or store meat underground, or so their culture has to change, and that affects, she argued in the book and in a talk that I've attended, it affects also their mental health and their ability to survive as a culture. And then on the other side, if we look at the sea level rise curves, which are at the bottom here, so they have, this time in the IPCC, they have chosen a very high sea level rise to illustrate how bad it could be, and the normal mid-range sea level rises. And in all cases, you're looking at sea level rise that is really going to be a severe threat to tropical islands. This is here a photo from Kiribati, where you can see that on high tide, a lot of the land is already very close to the sea level, and that could that will get worse as the sea level rises, and that is also something that will continue into the future quite a bit. And those kind of sea level events could get exacerbated by storms. So these countries are also exposed to very severe hurricanes, and those could the strongest could become more severe, and the storm surge will reflect the increased sea level rise. Yeah, that was that got a few slides that I wanted to share. Yeah, that was what I wanted to say on human rights as a physical scientist.